What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected actors walks onto a talk show set expecting a normal interview, only to face disrespect so shocking that it leads to an explosive confrontation? In just 35 seconds, a single comment turned a routine appearance into television chaos that would leave audiences stunned. Denzel Washington arrived at the studio that afternoon with nothing but good intentions. He was there to promote his latest film, a project he had poured his heart into for over 2 years. The audience was buzzing with excitement, phones ready to capture every moment with one of cinema's greatest talents. Tamron Hall walked onto the stage with her usual confidence, waving to the crowd as upbeat music filled the air. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but what was about to unfold would be anything but ordinary. The interview started simply enough. Tamron opened with a smile, welcoming Denzel as the crowd erupted in applause. He settled into the guest chair, relaxed and ready to discuss his work. The first few questions were standard fare about the new movie, his preparation for the role, working with the director. Denzel answered each question thoughtfully, giving the audience genuine insight into his creative process. He spoke about the challenges of bringing complex characters to life, about finding truth in every scene. The audience hung on every word. Then something shifted. Tamron's tone changed, her questions becoming more pointed, more personal. She leaned forward in her chair, a strange glint in her eye. "So, Denzel," she began, her voice taking on an edge, "let's talk about something real. Your career has been long, very long. Don't you think it's time to step aside and let younger actors have the spotlight?" The audience went quiet. A few uncomfortable laughs scattered through the crowd. Denzel's expression remained calm, though his eyes showed a flash of surprise. "Well, I think there's room for everyone," he replied, diplomatically. "The industry is big enough for actors of all ages and backgrounds. I don't see it as taking anyone's spot. We all bring different experiences to our work." Tamron wasn't satisfied with that answer. She pressed on, her smile now looking more like a smirk. "But seriously, at your age, aren't these action roles getting a little desperate? Like you're trying to prove something?" The audience gasped audibly. This was not normal talk show banter. This was personal, disrespectful. Denzel shifted in his seat, maintaining his composure but clearly taken aback by the hostility in her words. "I choose roles that challenge me as an artist," he said, his voice steady but firmer now. "Age has nothing to do with the stories I want to tell. If anything, experience makes me better at what I do." Tamron laughed, a sharp sound that cut through the tension. "Experience? Or just refusing to accept that your time has passed?" The studio audience was completely silent now. People looked at each other in disbelief. Camera operators exchanged confused glances. This was supposed to be a friendly promotional interview, not an interrogation. Producers in the control room were frantically trying to figure out what was happening, whether to cut to commercial, whether to intervene. Denzel took a deep breath. "Tamron, I came here to talk about my film, to share something I'm proud of with your audience. I'm not sure why you're taking this approach," but Tamron was just getting started. She seemed emboldened by her own audacity, feeding off the shock in the room. "Your film," she said, practically spitting the words. "Let's be honest. It's just another vanity project, isn't it? Another excuse for you to play the hero when maybe you should be thinking about mentoring instead of hogging the camera." That was the line. The moment everything changed. Denzel's jaw tightened. His hands gripped the armrests of his chair. For decades, he had handled difficult interviews with grace. He had faced tough questions, critical journalists, even hostile press conferences overseas. But this was different. This wasn't journalism. This wasn't even a debate. This was just meanness disguised as conversation. "Hogging the camera?" Denzel repeated, his voice low and controlled but vibrating with restrained frustration. "I've spent 40 years earning the respect of my peers and audiences. I've worked with thousands of people, helped launch careers, supported new voices in this industry. And you sit here and reduce all of that to vanity?" Tamron leaned back, crossing her arms, looking pleased with herself for getting such a reaction. "I'm just saying what people are thinking. Someone has to ask the tough questions." "Tough questions?" Denzel's voice rose slightly, the first crack in his careful composure. "There's a difference between tough questions and disrespect. You're not a journalist right now. You're just being cruel for ratings." The audience began to murmur. Some people nodded in agreement with Denzel. Others pulled out their phones, sensing that something truly dramatic was unfolding. This was the kind of moment that would trend online within minutes. the kind of confrontation that would be replayed and analyzed for weeks. Tamron's expression hardened. She had gone too far and seemed to realize it, but instead of backing down, she doubled down. It was a classic move of someone who felt their power slipping, someone who needed to reassert control. "Ratings?" she snapped. "That's rich coming from someone whose last 3 movies barely broke even. Maybe if you chose better projects instead of clinging to your glory days, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The room collectively held its breath. Audience members looked horrified. A woman in the front row had her hand over her mouth. A man 2 rows back shook his head slowly, unable to believe what he was hearing. These were not the words of a professional host. These were the words of someone trying to tear down a guest for sport, for ego, for some twisted sense of superiority. Denzel stood up. It was a simple movement, but it carried enormous weight. He straightened his jacket, looked directly at Tamron, and spoke with the quiet intensity that had made him one of the most powerful actors of his generation. "I've been doing this a long time," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "I've sat through countless interviews, talked to hundreds of hosts, answered thousands of questions. Some easy, some hard, some fair, some unfair. But I have never, in all my years, been treated with such blatant disrespect on someone's show." Tamron tried to interrupt, but Denzel raised a hand. Not aggressively, just firmly. "No, you've had your time to talk. Now it's mine." The studio was so quiet you could hear the hum of the stage lights, the distant sound of traffic outside, the nervous breathing of audience members watching history unfold. "You invited me." "Here," Denzel continued, "presumably because my name, my work, my presence means something to your viewers. And instead of having a conversation, instead of showing even basic courtesy, you decided to use this platform to attack me, to belittle my career, my choices, my dignity." Tamron finally looked uncomfortable. Her confident smirk had faded, replaced by something that looked almost like panic. She realized, perhaps too late, that she had miscalculated badly. She had thought she could control this moment, that her position as host gave her unlimited power. But respect is not about who holds the microphone. It's earned through how you treat people, especially when you have power over them. "Denzel, I think you're overreacting," Tamron said, trying to sound casual but coming across as defensive. "It's just a conversation. Can't you take a little pushback?" "Pushback?" Denzel's voice was incredulous now. "You called my life's work vanity. You mocked my age, my choices, my dedication to my craft. That's not pushback. That's an attack. And I won't sit here and pretend it's anything else." A producer appeared at the edge of the stage, whispering urgently to a crew member. The confusion behind the scenes was palpable. Should they go to commercial? Should they cut the cameras? This was live television, spiraling out of control, and nobody seemed to know how to handle it. Tamron stood up too now, trying to regain some authority. "Maybe we should take a break and discuss this off camera." "No," Denzel said firmly. "You wanted to do this in front of your audience. You wanted them to see you take down Denzel Washington. So let them see all of it. Let them see what happens when you forget that the people you interview are human beings who deserve respect." The audience was completely transfixed. Some people were recording on their phones, capturing every second. Others just stared, witnessing a masterclass in dignity under fire. This was not a celebrity meltdown. This was not an actor losing his temper. This was a man standing up for himself with precision and power. "You know what the sad part is?" Denzel asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I actually admired you. I thought you were doing important work, giving voice to stories that matter. But today, you showed that maybe you're more interested in spectacle than substance, more interested in tearing people down than building anything meaningful." Tamron's face flushed red. "You don't get to come on my show and lecture me about meaningful work. Do you know how hard I've worked to get here? The obstacles I've overcome? I'm sure you have worked hard." Denzel replied, "That's why this is so disappointing. You had a chance to do something worthwhile today. Instead, you chose pettiness." The confrontation had now gone on for several minutes, and still nobody had stopped it. The producers seemed frozen, unable, or unwilling to intervene. Perhaps they knew that stopping, it would only make things worse. Perhaps they realized that this moment, as uncomfortable as it was, needed to play out. Tamron took a step toward Denzel, her voice rising. "Pettiness? I ask real questions, unlike all the other hosts who just kiss up to celebrities. I'm not going to sit here and worship you just because you've been famous for a long time. Nobody asked you to worship anyone? Denzel shot back. But there's a universe of space between worship and disrespect. You could have asked challenging questions with respect. You could have pushed me on substantive issues. Instead, you went straight for personal attacks. That's not bravery. That's just mean. The audience began to react more vocally now. A few people applauded Denzel's words. Others called out in agreement. The balance of the room had shifted entirely. What had started as Tamron's show, her domain, her kingdom, had become a courtroom where she was being judged and found wanting. Tamron sensed the shift too. Her eyes darted to the audience, to the cameras, to her producers. She was losing control, and everyone could see it. "Fine," she said, her voice tight with anger and embarrassment. "If you can't handle a real interview, maybe you should leave." Denzel smiled, but it was a sad smile, the smile of someone who had hoped for better. "I was planning to. I don't stay where I'm not respected." He turned to the audience, his demeanor shifting completely. Gone was the tension, the anger. He looked at them with warmth and genuine appreciation. "I'm sorry you all had to witness this," he said to the crowd. "I know you came here expecting something different. I did too. But I want you to know that I appreciate your support, your love for the work we all do in this industry. Don't let this moment sour you on asking questions, on demanding substance from the people you give your time and attention to. Just remember that respect goes both ways." The audience erupted in applause. People stood up, giving Denzel a standing ovation right there in the middle of the chaos. It was a remarkable sight, the guests receiving more support than the host in her own studio. Tamron's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, humiliation, defiance. She tried to speak over the applause, tried to regain control of her show, but her voice was drowned out by the support for Denzel. A security guard appeared at the side of the stage. Tamron turned to him and said something the cameras didn't pick up, but her body language was clear. She was having Denzel removed. It was the ultimate power move, the final assertion of her authority. But it backfired spectacularly. The audience saw the security guard approach Denzel. They saw Tamron's gesture, her pointed finger, her angry expression, and they booed. Loud, sustained booing filled the studio. People shouted in protest. Some audience members stood up and started walking out themselves in solidarity with Denzel. Denzel raised his hands to calm the crowd. "It's okay," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's her show. She has every right to ask me to leave. I just wish it hadn't come to this." He walked toward the edge of the stage, the security guard awkwardly trailing behind him, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. As Denzel passed the front row, people reached out to shake his hand, to pat his shoulder, to show their support. He stopped briefly, thanking them, shaking hands, maintaining his grace even in this undignified exit. Tamron stood alone at center stage, surrounded by empty chairs and the judgmental stares of what remained of her audience. She tried to speak, to salvage something from the disaster. "We'll be right back after this break," she said, but her voice cracked. Nobody was buying it. The damage was done. Denzel reached the wings of the stage and paused, looking back one last time. Tamron met his eyes across the distance. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in her expression. Regret? Realization? But it passed quickly, replaced again by defensive anger. He shook his head slowly, a gesture that said everything without words, and walked off the stage. The audience's applause followed him all the way out, a thunderous validation of his dignity in the face of her hostility. Backstage, crew members stopped what they were doing as Denzel passed. Some looked sympathetic. Others looked embarrassed to be associated with what had just happened. A young production assistant approached him nervously. "Mr. Washington, I just want to say I'm really sorry about what happened out there. That wasn't right." Denzel paused and gave the young man a kind smile. "Thank you. That means a lot. Just remember this moment. Remember that how you treat people matters more than ratings, more than headlines, more than any temporary victory you might think you're winning." The production assistant nodded, clearly moved by the words. Denzel continued down, the hallway toward his dressing room, his publicist rushing to meet him, phone already pressed to her ear, no doubt dealing with the immediate fallout. Back on stage, Tamron was trying to regain her composure during the commercial break. Producers surrounded her, voices raised, gestures animated. The show was in crisis mode. How would they fill the rest of the hour? How would they address what had just happened? Could they even continue? But the real question being asked in living rooms, offices, and social media feeds across the country was simpler and more damning. What had Tamron been thinking? Why had she chosen to attack one of the most respected figures in entertainment? What had she hoped to gain? The answers to those questions would be debated and analyzed, but the core truth was already clear to everyone who had witnessed the confrontation. Tamron had made a catastrophic miscalculation. She had confused being provocative with being insightful, had mistaken cruelty for courage, had believed that her position as host gave her license to disrespect her guest. And Denzel, with his quiet dignity and measured words, had shown her and everyone watching that real power doesn't come from a title or a stage or a microphone. It comes from self-respect, from standing up for yourself without losing yourself, from knowing your worth and not letting anyone diminish it. In his dressing room, Denzel sat quietly for a moment, processing what had happened. His publicist was still on the phone, his agent was calling, messages were flooding in. But he took a breath, centered himself, and thought about what came next. Not revenge, not retaliation, not endless media appearances rehashing the drama. Just moving forward, continuing his work, letting his dignity speak louder than any controversy. He had walked into that studio as a guest and left as something more. A symbol of grace under pressure, of self-respect in the face of disrespect, of the power that comes from refusing to be diminished. The interview was over, but the lesson it taught would resonate far beyond those chaotic minutes on stage. What happens when entitled behavior meets quiet strength? When someone mistakes their platform for permission to attack? When cruelty is met not with equal cruelty but with dignity? The answer played out on that stage for everyone to see. Respect cannot be demanded, only earned, and once lost, it's nearly impossible to regain. Tamron had learned that lesson the hard way, in front of cameras, in front of an audience, in front of the world. And Denzel? He simply walked away, head held high, reputation intact, dignity unshaken. Because that's what happens when you know who you are and refuse to let anyone tell you different. That's what happens when you stand up for yourself without tearing others down. That's what happens when you choose grace over grudges, strength over spectacle, truth over tactics. The confrontation lasted less than 15 minutes, from start to finish. But in those 15 minutes, millions of people learned something about character, about respect, about the difference between having power and earning it. They watched an entitled host overplay her hand and a dignified guest refuse to be diminished. They saw pettiness exposed and grace rewarded. They witnessed, in real time, what happens when you forget that the person sitting across from you is not just content for your show, but a human being who deserves basic respect. Tamron Hall had wanted to create a moment. She had succeeded, just not the kind she had intended. Instead of proving her journalistic courage, she had exposed her lack of basic courtesy. Instead of taking down a celebrity, she had elevated him further. Instead of owning the narrative, she had lost control completely. The show that bore her name had become a cautionary tale about what happens when ego eclipses empathy, when ratings matter more than respect, when a host forgets that an interview is supposed to be a conversation, not a combat sport. And Denzel Washington, without raising his voice, beyond measured firmness, without resorting to insults or personal attacks, without losing his composure even once, had reminded everyone watching what real strength looks like. It looks like knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to walk away. It looks like defending yourself without attacking others. It looks like maintaining your dignity even when someone is actively trying to strip it from you. The audience members who had walked out in solidarity, who had booed the host and applauded the guest, had recognized this truth instinctively. They had seen something rare and valuable, a person refusing to participate in their own degradation, choosing self-respect over showmanship, principles over publicity. They had watched someone turn what was meant to be a humiliation into a masterclass in dignity, and they had responded with the only currency that truly matters. In television, their attention, their respect, their loyalty. As the cameras finally stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, the full weight of what had happened began to settle on everyone involved. Crew members quietly discussed what they had witnessed. Producers frantically worked on damage control. And somewhere in the building, Tamron Hall sat with the realization that she had turned what should have been a prestigious booking into a public relations nightmare, and there was no taking it back.